All right, in my workbook below this video, you're going to see there are 5 keys to success when finding the right place to grow those vegetables. And if you can master these 5 keys, then the seeds, the soil, and the sun are going to do most of the gardening for you. The first key should remind you of one of your early science lessons, and I'm sure this looks familiar to you. Here is how photosynthesis works. Your vegetable plants desire 4 basic things: sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and nutrients. In turn, your plants convert that sunlight and that carbon dioxide into sugar for their own growth and then oxygen for the rest of the planet. So our role as a steward is to work with Mother Nature and plant our vegetables where they will easily receive these 4 basic things. Now, there are also studies that suggest plants like a 5th thing, your voice or music, but that doesn't usually show up in the science books. So when we're talking about where to plant our vegetables, the most crucial consideration is how much sunlight the plant will receive. And I mentioned there are 4 more keys to success, water being one of them. I cover all of these in much more depth in my longer training courses. So how much sun does a vegetable plant need? Unfortunately, the photosynthesis diagram doesn't tell you, right? So when you go to plant stores, you'll see tags that say things like low light, medium light, high light, or you might see tags that say partial shade, partial sun, full sun. Vegetables, like this tomato tag here, typically say full sun. So what is the definition for full sun? Vegetables thrive when they receive sun all day long, but at a minimum, best practices will tell you that vegetables thrive with a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. That's what full sun means. Medium light is 4 to 6 hours, and some vegetables can grow under medium light, but those plants are typically rather stunted and slow growing. And I'll show you some comparison data later in this video, and you'll see why you might consider yourself a brown thumb if you have tried to grow in the shade before. And then there is low light, 2 to 4 hours of sunlight. This is where vegetables pretty much wither and die. They may sprout really well, but they won't grow into fully mature plants. So when you look at your space, you may notice it seems sunny or it seems shady, but how do you easily quantify exactly how many hours of sunlight it receives? And a common question at this point is whether you can get too much sunlight. So have you ever seen some of the vegetables that they grow in Alaska? The reason I ask is that parts of Alaska receive 18 to 22 hours of sunlight a day, and those vegetables thrive. That's because it's not also 100 degrees Fahrenheit there. So the second key to successfully locating your vegetable garden is to understand how the sun and the heat are interrelated. And that's a topic where I dive deeper in my longer courses. So remember, for now, our goal is a minimum 6 to 8 hours of sunlight every day throughout the season. If you know without a doubt that you get 6 to 8 hours of sunlight where you are, then you can skip forward in this video. For the rest of us, how do we calculate if we're receiving enough sun or not? So another way to say 6 to 8 hours of sunlight is that we're looking for areas with less than 16 hours of shade. So what we're actually doing when we measure the hours of sunlight is measuring shadows instead. And shadows are constantly on the move from sunup to sundown and throughout the season. You could track a whole lot of data to find out exactly how many hours of sun each part of your growing space gets every day of the growing season, but that would be a colossal waste of time and effort. So as part of my courses, I teach how to collect useful data to make informed decisions to help you grow more food. Otherwise, you're collecting a whole bunch of useless data and you're just wasting your time, and I don't want that for anyone. If you're like me, you've got plenty of other things you do as well as grow tons of veggies. So I use a super simple process to track those shadows. I walk outside and I simply observe the shadows, but there are just a few tricks to knowing when to look, how to record that data, and how to interpret that data. And even if you think you know how much sun your growing space gets, this exercise is quick and it may surprise you. So let's run through an example. This is an aerial view of Foxtrot Farmyard, one of my backyard farms in Brooklyn, outlined with red dots. And we're going to need to draw a map of the site so we can record our data. And here's that hand-drawn map of the site. Ideally, you want to scale the drawing as best you can. You can see the 3-story house shaded in black on the right side of the screen, and a 1-story garage shaded in black on the left side of the screen, as well as a chain link fence on the north and west sides of the site indicated by a dashed line, and a 6-foot-tall wooden fence along the south side of the site shown as a thick line. Lastly, you'll notice there are 3 bushes along the west side of the site and 1 large tree on the site next to the back porch. All of these plants are shaded in green. For people who are not used to looking at site drawings like this, it's important to note that when you're drawing trees or bushes, you draw a dark circle to show the size of the tree trunk, and then you draw a shaded green area that represents the size of the leaf canopy overhead. You may think, when looking at this drawing, that it's a bad idea to grow food under that tree, that it's too shady. After all, look at how big that green canopy is. But that's not necessarily the case, and I'll show you why a little later in this video. Now that you have your site map as a background, colored pencils or different colored highlighters are going to come in very handy for the next step. We now know we're looking for 6 to 8 hours of sunlight daily throughout the season. The most likely candidates for those sunlight hours are between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. When we observe every 3 hours, we can easily tally the total amount of sun in 3-hour increments. So recording the shadows at 9 a.m., 12 noon, and 3 p.m. is very effective. Ideally, I recommend going outside on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and I'll share more about why this day in a moment. At 9 a.m., draw an outline of all the shadows, lightly shading that outline in with one of your colored pencils, and here it's shaded in purple. Make sure you mark what time that color represents in a key. Then do the same thing at 12 p.m. in a different color and 3 p.m. in a third color. When you shade each time in different colors on the same page, you can clearly see which areas are always in sunlight because they have no shadows. There is still white page available. Those white areas very clearly get more than 6 hours of sun, and that's great. That's what we're looking for. Because if an area is not shaded at 9 a.m., 12 noon, and 3 p.m., then it's getting the requisite 6 hours of sunlight from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's when you're going to grow your vegetables. So while recording every 3 hours should give you most of the data you need to assess your site, you can shift those hours earlier or later if you think your site gets lots of early morning or late day sunlight and it would affect the results of the test. So try recording at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. additionally. Or you can shift to 7 a.m., 10 a.m., and 1 p.m. You get the idea. And once you have your shaded drawing, you could go one step further to distill all this information into one diagram like this one that labels the number of sunlight hours that each area gets. And at the start of this video, I mentioned that some veggies might grow within 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, and so you might be tempted to try. However, this is not ideal, and I don't recommend trying it unless you have experience growing in the proper amount of sunlight. Like I said earlier, we want to work with Mother Nature, and you're going to find that plants just don't grow as fast in only 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. You want easy wins as a beginner. Otherwise, you might start thinking of yourself as a brown thumb. And here's what I mean. I grew cabbage in the sun. Each head was over 2 pounds, and they arrived 60 days after I first transplanted them, just like the seed packet said they would. But I still had half my cabbage in the ground because it was in dappled shade. It was receiving just 4 hours of sun each day. So after another 60 days, 120 days total after I first planted them, the rest of the cabbage was ready. But each of those heads was only about 3/4 of a pound. So if this had been the first time growing anything, I would think I was a failure because the seed packet told me that they'd be ready in 60 days. Here it was 120 days, and they were so tiny. So I'd rather spend that 60 days finding more sun than watering and waiting for my tiny cabbage to come in. That's what I mean when I say you want to work with Mother Nature. You're going to be so happy that you did. Okay, so the process we walk through gives you data for one day of the year, which tells you a lot, but every day of the year is going to be different, right? Can you imagine how much work it would be to do the same exercise every day, 365 times? So again, we're going to track only the most relevant data for us to get the information that we're looking for. You only need to do this exercise 3 times a year, 4 maximum. There's a reason I recommended tracking shadows on the summer solstice. It's the longest day of the year, meaning the most sunlight hours. For many growing zones, the spring and fall equinoxes mark approximately the start and end of their growing seasons, so tracking shadows on those dates are important as well. And while you might think the spring and fall equinox shadows would be the same, there may be a difference due to the foliage on the trees, so I recommend doing both. And this drawing here shows the sun's movement on those important days from the northern hemisphere perspective. If you've mapped shadows on these 3 dates, you'll have a sense of the sun's movement throughout the season on your site. You may also want to include the winter solstice if you have mild winters or you plan to do some winter growing. And as you map your site, don't worry if you think you can't draw. Your drawing only has to make sense to you. Some of my students use gridded paper, like in my template below, to get their measurements as accurate as possible. Other students use an aerial image and draw right over the top of it, because that's really easy to do. Whatever makes sense for you to get the data you need to locate your garden beds. It doesn't have to be pretty to get you the data you need. You'll learn so much about your site if you make this exercise a priority to discover the sun pattern on your site. Now, why do I recommend tracking shadows on all 4 of those dates? Well, you might discover the place you wanted to grow vegetables doesn't get enough sun, or that you have less growing space than you realized in one of the seasons, or you may even discover new growing space that you never expected. Yes, there may be prime growing space right under your nose that you might not even recognize until you do this exercise. So no matter how much experience you have, take the data and find out. It may surprise you. So here's an example of finding new growing space. Take a look here at the difference in the 12 noon shadows on the summer and winter solstices. Underneath this big tree in June is a big shadow. The sun is right overhead. There's lots of foliage. Now look at December 21st, the winter solstice. The green area shows the area of the tree canopy overhead, but it's not necessarily where the shadow falls. The tree is so tall that the shadow falls all the way over on the neighbor's yard. What you'll notice is that the area right under the tree is a prime area for growing vegetables because it gets lots of sunlight. What you also notice is that the 6-foot fence at the south end of the site puts out a large shadow because the sun is so low in the winter sky, making a big part of the site unusable as growing space. So in the early spring, I grow a lot of lettuces under that tree, but as the solstice approaches, the area under that tree becomes a little less usable. As fall and winter approach, maybe I want to grow some winter greens in a greenhouse underneath that tree. I'm not going to locate my greenhouse anywhere near that fence, right? Because it's in shadow all day long. I'm going to grow under that tree, which seems like a strange place. So for you experienced growers out there who are looking for additional space to grow those vegetables and thinking about greenhouse growing in the winter, this is an exercise to determine where to put that greenhouse on your site. And for beginners, this is something that I might not recommend in your first growing season. Get the basics first before you start to build those greenhouses, and get a mentor on board when you do decide to build that greenhouse. Okay, so I hope this video helps you recognize that your growing space has what are called microclimates. And those microclimates mean that one area might be ideal for summer growing, another might be ideal other times of the season. I also hope you now have the tools you need to track the shadows on your site, that you could outline which areas of your site have those important 6 to 8 hours of sunlight daily throughout the season. Well, sunlight is not the only factor that makes growing food easy. It's possibly the most important one. And here are those 5 keys to success again, and you'll want to download the worksheets below this video to help you discover important data about your growing space. We go through all these keys to success in depth in my longer online training course, which will be opening enrollment in just a couple days. So let's talk briefly about what you might do if you don't have 6 to 8 hours of sunlight available in your own yard. If you are in a dense urban area or otherwise just have a lot of shade, here are 3 quick ideas for you. First idea, what about a movable planting bed on wheels, essentially a large container? You may not be connected to the earth's soil, but you can move the bed wherever it needs to go to soak up sun or find some precious shade if it's too hot. Second idea, we've been measuring shadows on the ground so far, but you can also measure the sunlight on vertical surfaces like walls and fences, so you can grow vertical. Not everyone has the space to grow their vegetables in the earth's soil, and that's okay. You can see one of my container gardens here, and it's thriving. And if you do choose container growing, the secret to your success will be learning how to manage the fertility and hydration of all of those individual containers. So to assess if a wall or a fence gets enough sunlight, it's the same exercise we just did, but flipped up onto the wall. So you're going to observe the vertical surface every 3 hours to see how much sunlight it gets. And a special trick for you container growers, those containers get hot and dry really quick. So midday sun and heat may not be as preferable as sun at dawn, depending on how hot and dry your location is. And I talk about container gardening in more depth in my longer courses as well. All right, so the third idea for those of you without growing space of your own, if you're serious about growing your own food, perhaps you need to enroll a neighbor in your plan, offer to grow food in their space, and share the harvest. This is literally how I got started in Brooklyn. I went to farmers markets, I stood on the street corners with flyers, and I yelled, "Hey, do you have a yard? Can I farm it?" And it worked. I got people interested, and it's how I got connected to this backyard. So there are people who love to grow food, and there are people who are not interested at all in growing food, but they do love eating fresh food and will gladly hand over the maintenance of their yard to you. So if you can find 100 square feet of space on someone's property, you can easily grow food for you and that homeowner, plus have some extra. In my longer Grow Your Own Vegetables course, I go into more detail about how to share yards if that's something that you're interested in. I have contract templates for you to use and best practices I've learned over the years. I'm really excited to share the details of that course with you later in this video series. Several of my past students are using my contract templates to successfully borrow yards and share fresh produce with neighbors. And I'm hoping that teens and adults watching this video who are interested in growing food start converting lawns to food production everywhere. Goodbye mowing lawns and hello delicious homegrown food. Imagine transforming the definition of local food system by growing food right in your own neighborhood. People are doing this everywhere, and so can you. You can do this. So your first task on your journey toward growing your own vegetables is to find at least 100 square feet of growing space near you. And again, here are those 5 keys to finding a space where your vegetables will thrive. Let Mother Nature do the work, sit back, relax, and watch it unfold. If you can find 100 square feet, you can grow your own vegetables. And if I can find space in Brooklyn, in one of the densest cities in the country, I'm sure you can find some space too, now that you know what you're looking for.